Hello, welcome to this video, and this video is going to be called The Greatest Guitarist of All Time. There's this thing on the internet now that you see, GOAT, G-O-A-T, Greatest of All Time. Such a stupid thing to apply to music. You know, how many of us would only have Miles Davis and not Led Zeppelin? How many of us would only have Bartok and not have AC/DC? You know, so I'm greedy, I want the lot. So such a stupid thing to think about music in terms of is who's the greatest. It's not possible to even go there. But there is some fun in discussing it, which is what I'm going to do today. And I'm going to give you who I think is the greatest of all time, but with the proviso that I do think it's absolute nonsense to talk about musicians in such a way. But how are we going to define it? Well, I think you'd have to define it in terms of popularity to some extent. You would have to define it in terms of innovation, in terms of technical ability. You'd have to define it in terms of your own personal preferences. You'd have to define it in terms of their cultural reach, right? So, you know, a guitarist like Sean Lane, who has such incredible technical facility on the guitar. If you want to really go and see a guitarist that is really technically able, then go and watch Sean Lane, and has other greater attributes musically as well. But he doesn't tick all those boxes. You know, his cultural influence is almost non-existent. There is some influence on him on guitar players, but not as much as so many other guitarists. In terms of popularity, he wasn't popular in his time. Go and check it out on YouTube and you'll see that every video he's in some club playing to about 30 people, it looks. So he doesn't tick all the boxes. When I've been asked in the past who the greatest guitarist of all time is, I've always split it between two guitar players. The first is Allan Holdsworth. And I think Allan Holdsworth has had some impact on culture, although pretty limited. But I would argue that his sound, you know, when you hear Eddie Van Halen playing on Beat It, that guitar solo, he's really channeling Allan Holdsworth on there. So that's where you hear Holdsworth approach really hitting a cultural nerve. In terms of technical facility and musicality, God, who's better than Holdsworth? In terms of influence on guitar players, you know, he's almost invents legato technique on guitar. He invented so much on guitar, you know, as well as influences so many guitar players. So Holdsworth, you know, I would, you know, rate as one of the greatest of all time. The other guitarist I always used to mention was Lenny Breau. Lenny Breau, if you are a guitar player and you don't know Lenny Breau, go and check him out. Lenny Breau was started off as a sort of Chet Atkins style country guitar player, and then he heard jazz, especially musicians like Bill Evans, and he, through his ability to sort of pick in such complex ways, he then applies that to sort of a Bill Evans harmonic approach to guitar, and also a sort of linear approach that is all of his own. You know, often when you're hearing Lenny Breau, his solo will blow you away. You'll think, oh God, this is incredible, and then you'll realise he's playing the chords at the same time. I don't want to go into Lenny Breau. I'm going to at some point talk about the live album he did, I think in 68, 69, because it's one of the greatest guitar albums of all time, and I will talk about that at some point. But yeah, Lenny Breau's the other guitarist. It's absolutely incredible. But I am not going to put those two forward as being the greatest of all time, and I'm not going to put forward John McLaughlin, who you know I love, and I know all of you love, and he's one of the great guitarists of all time, but I don't think he's the greatest of all time. Right, so who's the greatest guitarist of all time? Well, let's go back into my past, right? So I grew up, I loved heavy metal. I loved hard rock, Led Zeppelin, AC/DC, Motorhead, Judas Priest. That's the music that really first got me interested in music. You know, that's the music I wanted to play. But my dad was a big jazz fan, and I'd brought up listening to all sorts of different jazz musicians: Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, Dave Brubeck, Jerry Mulligan, Chico Hamilton, my jazz quartet. And I would, when my interest in music happened, I would go through my dad's record collection. My dad sadly died 6 years ago, and they're all behind me now. And some of my dad's records are records that he bought in the early 50s, right? And he had a strange little album that I'm about to show you, and it was made by, I think, the greatest guitarist of all time, and I would argue one of the great musicians of the 20th century. And we're going to get there, but I'm trying to draw it out because I know you're interested, and I want you to carry on watching the video. So, in the 1950s, my dad took a trip out to Paris. And while he was in Paris, he was able to buy a number of albums that you couldn't get in the UK. And back then they had 10-inch albums. And I'm going to show you the record because this is quite special, I think. And it's by who I think is the greatest guitarist of all time. And here is the record. Charlie Christian at Minton's, right? I think that this is the greatest guitarist that ever lived, right? But let's just have a look at this album. This is actually a 10-inch LP. So I have got the Inner Mountain Flame. There's the Inner Mountain Flame, and there's this album. You can see it's smaller. Don't know what year this was made, but this is obviously a copy from that time. There you go. There's the label. You can see it's in French. There's the other side. Okay. Do we have a date on here when this was recorded or when it was manufactured? No, it says made in France. It's a French record. If you I can't tell him, I don't speak French. There's the back. Okay, I think there's just 2 tracks on here. They're classic Charlie Christian tracks. The disc on the front is called Charlie Christian at Minton's. There's a date on the front of 1952. So this album could well be coming up to being 60 years old. Swing to Bop on that side and Stomping at the Savoy on that side. On the actual album it's called Charlie Christian Jazz Immortal. I grew up with this, so I put this on and listened to it. There I was listening to Richie Blackmore and Eddie Van Halen and Uli John Roth, Michael Schenker. And I'd put this on, you know, trying to see a link between that and this, you know. I remember thinking that the guitar playing was very fluid. It seemed more fluid than the guitarist I was listening to. That was what struck me at a very early age, because I heard this from a very young age. But I didn't quite get it. All right. As I got older, and this is something that I think is really interesting, is I think how many of us, heavy metal and heavy rock, hard rock, is the gateway towards jazz. So I went from heavy rock to sort of hard rock to sort of, you know, then to prog rock and then to jazz fusion. And then when I got to jazz fusion, I started to notice that some of the stuff they're doing was similar to some of my dad's albums. My dad did have a Billy Cobham album, Crosswinds, and that was the album for me. Around that time, there were still on the TV, there would be sort of jazz programs. Oscar Peterson had a program where he would bring on various musicians to showcase them. And one of those was Joe Pass. I didn't quite understand Joe Pass. I didn't understand what was going on. I didn't understand with the chords. I didn't understand the way they were playing chord melodies. I didn't understand the jazz standard. This was all stuff I was learning. But as I learnt more, I started to realise that these guitarists like Joe Pass and Wes Montgomery and Pat Martino, the late great Pat Martino, they were doing something that was beyond what the rock guys were doing. And I started to realise that although Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads were fantastic, what they were doing was slightly different. And I started to track it through. And then I discovered musicians like Tal Farlow, and I realised that all this had been done before, all this fast picking and the scales had all been done before. The electric guitar had been pioneered. Now, where do you go to the source of that? Well, I would argue it's Charlie Christian. So let's now go to the other end of it. You know, the guitar is basically, you know, an acoustic classical instrument. You think of a classical guitar like Segovia, Rodrigo. You know, you think of them as an instrument that's been played, you know, it's been strummed and plucked. No one's playing single line solos. So when jazz emerges and Louis Armstrong's playing single line solos on trumpet, you know, and then Johnny Hodges is playing on saxophone and all this is going on, the guitars has to discover a way of doing that. And the guitarist that does that is a guitarist called Lonnie Johnson. And to some extent Eddie Lang, but definitely Lonnie Johnson. Lonnie Johnson and Eddie Lang had a guitar duo in the 1920s they were recording. They're very influential. But on acoustic guitar. Then in the 30s, Django Reinhardt comes out and he really takes the sort of Eddie Lang style and Lonnie Johnson style and he pushes it. He really pushes it forward. And Django, God, one of the great guitarists of all time, you know. Perhaps the second greatest. But we're talking about electric guitar here. The big band thing is happening. It's in full swing. Literally, it's in full swing. And all these superstars are coming out. You know, Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, and then Lester Young, Coleman Hawkins, Johnny Hodges. All these musicians are coming out, all incredible single line solos. But the guitarists, they can't compete, right? Because they haven't got the volume. Okay? In the 30s, electric guitar starts to get developed. So Gibson bring out a Gibson 175, I think. I'm not an expert on this, but I think Gibson bring out the 175 and you can attach a pickup to that. And they got a rudimentary amp. But guitar is really still, electric guitar is really still has a rhythm role. You know, in jazz you'd had a banjo and that's the way the guitar is thought of, almost like a rhythmical instrument, part of the rhythm section. Charlie Christian takes those ideas from Lonnie Johnson, Eddie Lang, and Django Reinhardt, and he puts it onto an electric guitar. Right? He does this at a very young age, and he gets discovered for it. So Benny Goodman discovers him in 1939, and Benny Goodman's one of the biggest artists. So the cultural influence of what Charlie Christian does is huge. So suddenly everyone's hearing this incredible guitar player, right? So yes, there's an argument there that he's the greatest of all time. You know, he's the first electric guitarist. He transfers all that language onto electric guitar from swing, and everyone hears him, and then all the guitarists are influenced by him, and that's why he's really, really important, right? The other day I thought, I haven't heard Charlie Christian for ages. I'm going to have a listen to him. And I put some recordings on, including that Swing to Bop that's on that record, which I know so well. But now, at my age, it struck me in a completely different way. What I heard was a guitarist who's basically invented the language of electric guitar playing. And when he does it, it sounds natural. His tone and sound, I think, is as great, if not greater, than any guitarist that came after him. He had a sound on the guitar which is absolutely penetrating, whereas a lot of jazz guitarists that came after him can sound a little bit fluffy and not quite articulated well. And I'm talking about some of the greats. You don't hear that with Charlie Christian. He's like a drummer. His phrasing as well is so beyond the harmony. He feels totally at home. So what I'm arguing here is Charlie Christian is not just the first electric guitarist. He's one of the greatest soloists ever on any instrument. That's why he's so great. He's not great because he's a great jazz guitarist. He's great because he's a great jazz musician. And he's pushing, at that time, the way of soloing so far out that he really is pioneering what's going to happen in bebop. Now, there is a story, I don't know if it's apocryphal, but the word bebop was created by Charlie Christian to describe what he was doing on guitar. Right? If Charlie Christian was the first great instigator of bebop, now remember Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, those musicians are coming out really in the 1945, 44, 45, 46. Well, Charlie Christian's incredible because he comes out in 1939. He really does change the face of music, and he dies in 1942 at the age of, I think, 25. This is remarkable. Absolutely remarkable that in those 3 years, right, he was able to not only change the direction of jazz, but create the language of electric guitar. What he did on electric guitar, right, is going to influence all guitar players, not just jazz guitarists. I'm going to give you an example of this. If and I've spoken about this on other videos, but I'm going to say the story again. You know, if you listen to Johnny B. Good, which is where rock and roll guitar really begins. Chuck Berry opens up with a phrase, which is like a blues phrase. It's like an Elmore James guitar lick. He goes, which is that sort of, it's like a blues Elmore James type lick. But then he follows it up like this, and I'll sing the whole phrase. He goes, and he links those two blues licks with this lick, and that there, you go, well, that's a bebop line, isn't it? It's not a Louis Armstrong line. It doesn't sound like Louis Armstrong. Maybe it sounds like Coleman Hawkins. Coleman Hawkins pushing the harmony, but now I'll tell you what it sounds like. That sounds like Charlie Christian, right? That's the importance. There's the importance. And when you go back and listen to Charlie Christian, and I suggest after this video you do that, go back and listen to Charlie Christian and put it on. Listen to his phrasing. He's free. God, he's played free jazz before any of those guys of the 60s, right? The chord progressions, the structure's not hemming him in. I believe this is a hallmark of the truly great musicians. When I hear Louis Armstrong, it doesn't sound like he's trying to sound like anybody else. It sounds like it's his music, he's made it, and it's him. Everyone else is trying to be like him, but he's just being himself, right? If I listen to Ella Fitzgerald, I don't hear a singer that sounds like they're trying to copy Bessie Smith or Billie Holiday, right? And the true same of Bessie Smith and Billie Holiday. I hear someone that just sounds like they're doing what they do. And because they're doing what they do, it becomes completely natural to them, right? I think when I hear Django, I hear that. But I think with Charlie Christian, I also hear it. His actual sound, his sound on the guitar is greater than any other guitarist, jazz guitarist afterwards. His way of picking is so smooth and accurate. You don't hear that slight fluffiness that you often hear with some of the later guitarists that came in. His phrasing is absolutely free. He can go anywhere he wants. His use of chromaticism is absolutely incredible, and he's pushing those lines towards what's going to happen in bebop. This is a really impressive thing, I think. And you can hear it. After that, the guitarists that come in after that, like Barney Kessel and Tal Farlow and all that, they're only going to take what Charlie Christian does and just advance it in slight technical areas. I think it could be argued that when Wes Montgomery comes out in the 60s, he's then the next jazz guitarist to really create another way of playing jazz. Jim Hall to some extent, But even then, I still think they're building on what Charlie Christian does. I don't think it's till the rock guys come out and really start changing the tone of the guitar, which are informed by blues guitarists. But you've got to remember that people like B.B. King and T-Bone Walker, they are equal as influenced as jazz guitarists by Charlie Christian. So I think the greatest of all time is Charlie Christian. I think if I take my parameters of technical ability, a virtuoso guitarist, an absolute virtuoso. His picking and his fingering the guitar, his harmonic knowledge, his musicianship, that's his second to none. We know that. Popularity. He played with the Benny Goodman group, but the Benny Goodman group was the most popular group in jazz at that time. That and Glenn Miller, I would say. So he got played on the radio all the time. Really popular musician. This is why he had so much influence. He's changed music. I really think Charlie Christian needs to be seen as being one of the great jazz musicians of the 20th century. I think we need to be able to go Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Charlie Christian, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, John Coltrane, John McLaughlin. Right. The two that don't sit there is Charlie Christian and John McLaughlin. There seems to be a snobbery around the guitar. Doesn't there? There seems to be a snobbery in jazz around the guitar. Of course, jazz is important in that it pioneers a certain way of playing. And perhaps the guitar is as associated with rock music, which is why the legacy isn't counted so highly. But there is another video. I think I'm now moving into realms beyond that. But yeah, who was the greatest guitarist of all time? Silly question, no such person. But if I had to be pushed to say, it would be Charlie Christian. Thank you very much.